The night Elena Carter was sold did not begin with chaos. It began with silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that exists just before something irreversible happens. A silence built on control, on power, on decisions already made long before she ever realized she was part of them. Elena had always believed that her life, no matter how difficult, still belonged to her. That belief ended the moment she woke up in the dark. Her head felt heavy, her body slow to respond, as if every nerve had been delayed. The air around her was unfamiliar, too clean, too controlled. Not the smell of the streets she had grown used to, not the worn-out apartments or temporary shelters she had survived in. This place was different, and that difference was the first warning. Elena Carter had spent most of her life learning how to survive without relying on anyone. Losing her parents at a young age had not just taken away her family. It had taken away any illusion of security. The foster system that followed was not cruel in obvious ways, but it was cold, inconsistent, and indifferent. She learned quickly. Trust was not given. It was dangerous. So she built herself carefully, quietly, piece by piece. She worked small jobs, stayed invisible, avoided conflict, and created a life that, while fragile, was hers. It wasn't perfect, but it was controlled. And that control was everything, until it was taken. The memory of that night came back in fragments. A familiar face, a voice she didn't question, a drink she didn't hesitate to accept. Then darkness, not the kind that comes with sleep, but the kind that erases time. When her vision finally adjusted, she realized she was not alone. But no one spoke. That was the second warning. The room she found herself in was not a prison in the traditional sense. There were no visible chains, no obvious threats. Instead, it was designed with precision. Clean lines, minimal structure, controlled lighting. It wasn't meant to contain chaos. It was meant to control it. Other figures were present, scattered across the space. Some sat still, some stared forward, some looked like they had already given up. But no one resisted, and that silence, the shared understanding without words, was more terrifying than panic ever could be. Elena didn't panic, not because she wasn't afraid, but because fear, she had learned, was only useful if it was controlled. So she observed the doors, the cameras hidden but present, the timing of movements, the way individuals entered and exited without hesitation. This wasn't random. This wasn't disorganized. This was a system, and systems had rules. That realization came with a deeper, more unsettling thought. If this was a system, then she had a role in it. Hours, or maybe longer, passed before anything changed. Time felt distorted in that place. Eventually, movement began. Not chaotic movement. Coordinated. Precise. Individuals were taken one by one. No struggle. No noise. Just disappearance. Until it was her turn. Elena didn't resist when they came for her. Not because she accepted it, but because she understood something critical. Resistance without understanding was pointless. She needed information, and information required observation. They led her through a corridor that felt less like a hallway and more like a transition point between worlds. Because what waited on the other side was not hidden anymore. It was displayed. The space she was brought into was unlike anything she had ever seen. Luxury, but not in a way that invited comfort. It was cold, intentional. Every detail designed to communicate one thing: power. The room was large, structured like a private event reserved for individuals who did not need permission to exist in such spaces. And the people inside it, they were not ordinary. They didn't behave like criminals. They behaved like decision-makers. Men in tailored suits, calm expressions, measured movements, no wasted energy. These were individuals who didn't react. They decided. And suddenly, Elena understood. This wasn't just a place. It was a market, but not for objects, for people. The realization didn't come as a shock. It came as confirmation. Everything, the silence, the system, the structure, had led to this. She was not here by accident. She was here by design. Her position in the room made it clear she was not among the observers. She was among the observed. A subtle shift in the room's energy signaled the beginning. No loud announcement, no dramatic introduction, just a quiet acknowledgement that something was about to start. And then, the first bid. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be, because in a room like that, power didn't raise its voice. It didn't have to. Elena didn't react outwardly, but internally, everything sharpened, every sound, every movement, every shift in posture. She watched them the way they watched her, analyzing, measuring, understanding, because even in that moment, especially in that moment, she refused to be reduced to nothing. If she was part of their system, then she would understand it, use it, survive it. The bidding continued, calm, controlled, almost casual, as if what they were doing was not only normal, but expected. That was the most disturbing part, not the act itself, but the lack of resistance to it, the complete normalization of control. Elena felt fear, but it wasn't overwhelming. It was focused, directed, because now she understood something clearly. This wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about justice. It was about power, and she had been placed directly inside it, not randomly, intentionally. That thought settled heavily in her mind, because it meant one thing. Someone had planned this. Someone had decided she belonged here, and that meant this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. Then something changed, not in her. In the room, the shift was immediate, subtle but undeniable, the kind of shift that only happens when someone important enters. Conversations stopped, not because they were told to, but because they chose to. Postures straightened, attention redirected, respect or fear moved through the room without a single word being spoken. Elena noticed it instantly, because she had been watching everything. And this was different. The doors open again. But this time, it wasn't routine. It wasn't controlled movement. It was presence, a presence that didn't need introduction, didn't need explanation, because everyone already knew. And the moment he stepped inside, the room changed completely. Not louder, not more chaotic, but quieter, more controlled, as if even power itself had adjusted to make space for something greater. Elena didn't look away. She couldn't, because whatever had just entered the room was now the center of everything. And for the first time since she had woken up in that place, she felt something unfamiliar, not fear, not confusion, but something deeper, something sharper, awareness, because instinctively she understood this man wasn't like the others. He wasn't just part of the system. He controlled it. Cliffhanger. As the bidding for her continues, the room falls into complete silence, because a man who just entered doesn't compete, he decides. The silence that followed his arrival did not feel natural. It felt controlled. Not the kind of silence created by fear alone, but the kind shaped by recognition. Every person in that room understood something at the same time, without needing explained. Power had just entered, and it did not need permission. Dante Voss did not rush his steps. He did not announce himself. He did not acknowledge the room in any obvious way. Yet everything shifted around him as if it had been waiting. The structure of authority, previously spread across multiple powerful figures, collapsed into a single point of focus. Conversations ended mid-thought. Movement slowed. Even the air itself seemed to adjust, tightening with a kind of invisible pressure, because men like Dante Voss did not exist within systems. They became the system. Elena noticed it instantly, not because she recognized him, but because she recognized the effect. She had spent her entire life reading people, not their words, but their reactions. It had been her way of surviving environments where control shifted constantly and unpredictably. And this was not shifting. This was absolute. Dante Voss moved through the space with quiet precision, his presence carrying no unnecessary motion. His expression revealed nothing. No arrogance, no impatience, no visible intent. That absence of visible emotion was not emptiness. It was discipline. He did not need to display power, because everyone around him already adjusted to it. The bidders who had been engaged moments before began to withdraw. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but with subtle understanding. Hands lowered, postures changed, attention redirected. It wasn't surrender. It was recognition of hierarchy. And in that hierarchy, Dante Voss stood at the top. The bidding, once a structured competition, began to transform, not into chaos, but into something quieter, more calculated. A psychological battlefield where no one truly believed they could win, but some still attempted to test the boundaries of his interest. Elena remained still, not frozen, not passive, observing, because this was the moment everything clarified. The system she had begun to understand, the structure, control, the silent agreements, the calculated power, now had a center, and that center was him. Dante's gaze moved across the room with deliberate precision. He did not scan randomly. He assessed, measured, filtered, until his attention settled on her. The shift was immediate, not in the room, in her awareness, because unlike the others, his attention did not feel intrusive. It felt focused, intentional, as if he was not simply looking at her, but analyzing her, breaking down every detail, every reaction, every lack of reaction. Elena did not look away, not because she was unafraid, but because she understood something critical. Looking away would give him information, and she wasn't ready to give him anything yet, so she held his gaze, calm, controlled, unreadable, that, more than anything, created the first fracture in the expected pattern, because people in her position did not hold eye contact. They avoided it. They submitted to it. They broke under it. She did none of those things. And Dante noticed, not through expression, but through stillness, a slight pause, a fraction longer than necessary, enough to confirm that something about her did not align with expectation. The bidding resumed, but it no longer felt like competition. It felt like formality. Numbers were spoken, but without conviction, without belief, because the outcome was already understood. Dante did not raise his voice. He did not engage emotionally. Each bid he made was measured, precise, and final in its tone. Not aggressive, not reactive, decisive. The others responded less and less, not because they lacked resources, but because they lacked reason. Challenging him was not worth the cost, not in money, but in consequence. Elena watched the shift happen in real time, watched power redefine the structure of the room without needing to force it, and in that moment, a realization settled within her. This man did not dominate through chaos. He dominated through control, complete, unquestioned, and that made him far more dangerous than anyone else present. The bidding ended without resistance, without argument, without acknowledgement, because in a room like that, endings were not negotiated. They were accepted. The decision had been made. Elena was no longer part of the system. She belonged to it, specifically to him. But what unsettled her was not the outcome. It was his reaction to it, or rather, the lack of one. Dante did not display satisfaction. He did not show ownership. He did not even look at the others who had just withdrawn. His attention remained exactly where it had been from the beginning, on her, not possessive, not curious in a simple sense, but something more complex, as if he had not just acquired something, but identified something. Elena felt it then, not fear, not confusion, but something sharper, a shift in the dynamic she had just begun to understand, because in that moment she realized he had not chosen her randomly, and more importantly, he had not finished evaluating her. That was the most dangerous part, because being chosen was one thing, being studied was another, and Dante Voss was not a man who made incomplete decisions. The room began to return to movement, but it no longer mattered. The structure had changed. The hierarchy had reestablished itself, and she had been moved within it, not as an object, not entirely, but not as something free either, something in between, something undefined. Dante finally took a step forward, not toward the center of the room, not toward the others, but directly toward her. Each movement was controlled, measured, without urgency, because urgency implied uncertainty, and he had none. Elena remained still, not because she had no choice, but because she understood this moment mattered more than anything that had happened so far, because this was no longer about the system. It was about him, and whatever he had seen in her, it had been enough. Enough to act, enough to decide, enough to claim. but not enough to satisfy. And that difference was everything. Because satisfaction ends interest, but curiosity creates something far more unpredictable and far more dangerous. Dante stopped at a distance that was deliberate, close enough to observe, far enough to maintain control. His gaze remained unchanged, still analytical, still precise, still unreadable, but now focused entirely, as if the rest of the room had ceased to exist. And in that moment, Elena understood something she had not allowed herself to fully consider before. This was not the end of her situation. This was the beginning of something far more complex. Because whatever Dante Vos had seen in her, it had not answered his questions. It had created more. And men like him did not walk away from unanswered questions. They pursued them, controlled them, owned them. Cliffhanger. Dante Vos wins the auction without resistance, but instead of satisfaction, his eyes remain fixed on her, as if she is not something he owns, but something he intends to understand. Power rarely explained itself. It acted, decided, and moved forward without justification. And yet, as Elena Carter was escorted out of the underground auction and into a world that clearly belonged to Dante Vos, one question lingered in the air, not spoken, but felt by everyone who understood the rules of power. Why her? Because men like Dante Vos did not make unnecessary decisions. Every action he took carried purpose. Every choice had structure. And nothing about her, seemed to fit into any clear purpose. That was what made it dangerous. The transition from the underground hall to Dante's estate felt less like movement and more like displacement, as if she had been removed from one controlled environment and placed directly into another, just more refined, more sophisticated, more absolute. The vehicle that transported her moved in silence. No unnecessary sound, no conversation, only the quiet hum of precision and control. Elena sat still, her mind working through every detail she had observed so far. She didn't focus on escape. Not yet, because escape required understanding, and she was still gathering pieces. When the vehicle finally stopped, the shift in atmosphere was immediate. The estate that stood before her was not just a residence. It was a statement, massive, structured, and designed with the kind of precision that reflected a mind obsessed with control. Clean architectural lines, guarded perimeters, surveillance embedded so seamlessly it almost disappeared into the design. Nothing about it invited comfort. Everything about it enforced authority. This was not a home. It was a command center disguised as one. Elena stepped inside without resistance, not because she accepted her situation, but because she understood something crucial. Resistance without leverage meant nothing, and she had none. Yet, the interior mirrored the exterior. Minimalist, controlled, almost cold in its perfection. Every object placed with intention. Every space calculated. No excess. No chaos, because chaos disrupted power. And Dante Vos did not allow disruption. She was led through corridors that seemed endless, each one identical in its precision. No visible guard in abundance. Yet the presence of security was undeniable. Hidden, efficient, watching, just like him. When they finally stopped, she was placed in a room that felt different from the rest. Not softer, not more comfortable, but contained. Designed to observe rather than confine. And that difference mattered, because it meant something. She was not being held. She was being studied. That realization settled deeply, and with it came the first real shift in her understanding of the situation. Most people in her position would expect immediate control, commands, restrictions, punishment, something that reinforced their lack of power. But none of that came. Instead, nothing happened. Time passed. Slowly, deliberately. No one entered. No instructions were given. No attempts were made to establish dominance in the way she expected. And that absence, that calculated absence, was more unsettling than any direct action could have been, because it forced her to think, to question, to analyze. Why delay control? Why create space instead of enforcing it? The answer was not simple, which meant the intention wasn't either. Elsewhere in the estate, subtle shifts were already taking place. Members of Dante's inner circle had noticed, not openly, not in ways that challenged him, but in quiet observations, because they understood him, and they understood patterns. And this did not follow any known pattern. Dante Voss did not purchase without purpose. He did not invest without return. And he certainly did not bring unknown variables into his controlled environment without already understanding them. Yet this situation suggested something different, something incomplete. And that alone was enough to create tension. Back in the room, Elena moved carefully, not searching for escape, not testing boundaries recklessly, but observing, measuring, learning. She noticed the placement of objects, the angles of cameras, the rhythm of distant movement. Everything spoke the same language. Control, but not immediate control. Delayed, intentional. She understood then this was not about breaking her. If it were, it would have happened already. This was about something else, something deeper, something that required her to remain exactly as she was, unbroken, unpredictable. And that realization carried a different kind of weight, because it meant she was not here to be reduced. She was here to be understood. And understanding in a world like this was far more dangerous than control. When Dante finally appeared, it was without announcement, no warning, no signal, just presence. The room changed the moment he entered, not dramatically, but subtly, as if the environment itself recognized him. Elena turned her attention toward him immediately, not out of submission, but out of awareness, because everything in this space revolved around him. Dante did not approach her immediately. He remained at a distance, watching, not in a way that suggested curiosity alone, but in a way that suggested evaluation. His gaze moved over her with precision, as if confirming details against something only he understood. Elena remained still, not passive, controlled, because she understood this was a test, not one defined by questions, but by reaction. And reactions revealed weakness. She offered none. The silence between them was not empty. It was structured, filled with unspoken analysis on both sides. He was trying to find her. She was trying to understand him. And neither of them was succeeding completely. That imbalance, that lack of clarity, created tension, not loud, not explosive, but sharp, focused, dangerous, because uncertainty was the one thing control could not fully eliminate. Dante took a step forward, measured, deliberate. His presence felt heavier now, not physically, but psychologically, because distance had been reduced, and proximity created pressure. Still, he said nothing. Still, he revealed nothing, but his attention, his complete, undivided attention, remained on her, and that attention carried a message clearer than any words could have. She mattered, not as a possession, not as an object, but as something unresolved, something incomplete, something he had not yet understood. And men like Dante Voss did not tolerate the unknown. They studied it, controlled it, mastered it. Elena felt the shift within herself, not fear, not submission, but awareness, because she realized something critical. This was not a situation she had been placed into randomly. This was something she had been chosen for. And if she had been chosen, then there was a reason she did not yet know, but one he might already suspect. That thought changed everything, because it meant the balance between them was not as simple as it appeared. Not control versus powerless, but knowledge versus uncertainty. And in that balance, power could shift. Dante finally turned away, not because he had finished, but because he had seen enough. For now, that distinction mattered, because it meant this was not over, not even close. Moments later, in another part of the estate, a secure file was placed in front of him, classified, restricted, information that had taken time and effort to gather, information about Elena Carter. Dante opened it without hesitation. His expression remained unchanged as he read, cold, controlled, unmoved, until it didn't. Something in the file shifted his focus, not dramatically, not visibly to most, but enough to confirm one thing. He had not made a mistake, but he had not made a complete decision either, because whatever he had just discovered, it didn't simplify the situation. It complicated it. And for the first time since he had entered the auction, Dante Voss was not looking at a completed outcome. He was looking at a beginning. Cliffhanger. Dante studies a classified file in silence, and for the first time his expression changes slightly, because what he discovers about Elena is not what he expected. It's something far more dangerous. Power was built on information, and information, when incomplete, was the only thing capable of destabilizing even the strongest empires. Dante Voss understood this better than anyone, which was why the moment the file on Elena Carter revealed something unexpected, it stopped being a routine verification and became a problem he could not ignore. The room he stood in was quiet, sealed away from the rest of the estate. No distractions, no interruptions, just controlled space and controlled thought. The file remained open in front of him, but he was no longer just reading it. He was reconstructing it, piece by piece, because what he was seeing did not align with the version of Elena Carter that existed on the surface. On paper, her life was simple, predictable, forgettable, a child who lost her parents early, a system that failed to protect or shape her, a life built from fragments, from survival, from quiet resilience. Nothing about that profile justified what it had just uncovered. Nothing about it explained why her name appeared in places it should not. That was the first inconsistency. And in Dante's world, inconsistencies were never accidental. They were deliberate, hidden, designed to be overlooked. He shifted his focus to the deeper layers of the file, the parts that had not been easy to access. Encrypted records, redacted connections, fragments of data that only revealed themselves when someone knew exactly where to look. And Dante always knew where to look. The more he uncovered, the clearer the pattern became. Elena Carter's past was not empty. It had been erased, carefully, intentionally, which meant someone had invested time, power, and resources into making her invisible. And that raised a more important question. Why? Elena, meanwhile, remained unaware of the full scope of what was unfolding around her, but she felt the shift, not in obvious ways. Nothing in her environment had changed dramatically. The structure remained the same. The silence remained the same. But there was something beneath it now, a subtle tension, an undercurrent, as if the system around her had adjusted in response to something she could not yet see. She moved through the space with the same controlled awareness she had maintained since the beginning, but internally, questions had begun to surface, because nothing about her situation made sense anymore. Being sold could be explained. Betrayal could be understood. Even being placed under the control of someone like Dante Voss had its own brutal logic. But this level of attention, this level of scrutiny, it didn't match her life. At least, not the life she thought she had lived. That disconnect was the beginning of something dangerous, because once doubt entered, nothing remained stable. Back in his private office, Dante continued his investigation, and then he found it. Not a complete record, not a clear explanation, but a connection, a name, buried deep within an old, nearly forgotten file. A name that should not have been connected to Elena Carter in any way. Yet it was, and the moment he saw it, something within his otherwise controlled expression shifted, not visibly to most, but enough to confirm one undeniable truth. This was not coincidence. This was history, and history, when left unresolved, had a way of returning in the most unexpected forms. The name belonged to a past Dante had already buried, or at least believed he had. Years ago, before his empire reached its current level of dominance, there had been a fracture, not external, internal, a betrayal, one that had not just threatened his position, but nearly destroyed everything he had built. It had come from someone he had trusted, someone who had understood his system, his methods, his weaknesses. That betrayal had not been random. It had been calculated, strategic, personal, and it had forced Dante to do something he rarely allowed himself to do. Adapt. He had eliminated the threat, destroyed the network connected to it, erased every trace. Or so he believed, because now that same network was resurfacing, not directly, not openly, but through a single, unexpected connection. Elena Carter. The implications were immediate and Dangerous, because if she was connected to that past, then her presence in his world was not accidental. It was intentional, which meant one thing. Someone had placed her there, or allowed her to be placed. Either way, this was no longer about a purchase. This was about strategy. Elena, unaware of the full truth but no longer able to ignore the inconsistencies, began to question everything she remembered. Her past, her childhood, the fragmented memories she had always accepted as incomplete but real. What if they weren't? What if the gaps were not just a result of trauma, but of removal, of alteration? The thought unsettled her more than anything that had happened so far, because fear of the present could be managed, but uncertainty about the past, that was something else entirely. It meant she did not fully know who she was. And in a world built on control, identity was everything. Dante closed the file slowly, not because he was finished, but because he had reached a point where information alone was no longer enough. Now, he needed confirmation, because if his conclusion was correct, then Elena Carter was not just a variable. She was a trigger, a link to something that had never truly been resolved. And that made her dangerous, not in the way others in his world were dangerous, not through power or influence, but through connection, because connections created vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities, even the smallest ones, could collapse entire empires. The realization did not create hesitation. It created focus, sharper, more precise, because now Dante understood something he had not fully acknowledged before. Bringing her into his world had not been a risk. It had been a step, one that had already set something into motion. And motion, once started, cannot be undone, only controlled. But control required understanding, and understanding required truth. The problem was, truth was rarely simple. And in this case, it was becoming something far more complicated than he had anticipated. Moments later, new information arrived, not from his internal systems, but from external surveillance, something he had not yet activated personally, which meant someone else was already moving. The report was brief, precise, but its implication was immediate. A network, powerful, organized, and deeply embedded, had begun searching, not broadly, not randomly, specifically for her, Elena Carter. Dante's expression remained controlled as he processed the information, but internally, everything aligned. The erased past, the hidden connections, the resurfacing network. This was not coincidence. This was convergence. And convergence in his world meant conflict, not potential conflict, inevitable conflict. Because if they were searching for her, then they knew something valuable, something worth risking exposure for. And if they were willing to risk that, then they were not small, not insignificant. They were powerful enough to move against him. And that was something very few were capable of, which meant one final realization settled into place. Elena Carter was no longer just part of his world. She had become the center of something much larger, something that had been building long before she ever stepped into that auction. And now, it was coming for her. Cliffhanger. Dante studies the incoming report in silence, realizing that someone powerful is already searching for Elena, and for the first time in years he understands this is not a threat he can ignore. Control was never absolute. It only appeared that way until something unpredictable entered the equation. And Elena Carter had become exactly that. The shift from uncertainty to confirmation came quietly, just as everything else in Dante Voss's world did. There was no dramatic announcement, no visible escalation, only a decision. And decisions in his world carried more weight than actions. Elena noticed a change before she understood it, not because anything around her had visibly altered, but because the rhythm of the environment had shifted. Movements were sharper. Timing was tighter. The invisible system that controlled everything within the estate had adjusted itself in response to something unseen. That kind of adjustment only happened when a threat had already been identified. She didn't need to ask. She already knew. Somewhere beyond the walls of this controlled world, something had begun moving toward her. Dante confirmed it without ceremony. When he entered the room this time, there was no distance in his posture, No passive observation. His presence carried a different kind of weight, more focused, more deliberate. This was no longer about studying her. This was about containing something. Elena Carter was not meant to disappear, was the conclusion behind his silence. And now, neither was the truth connected to her. He didn't explain everything. Men like Dante Voss never did. They gave only what was necessary. But what he revealed was enough. She was being searched for, not randomly, not casually, but deliberately. And the ones searching were not ordinary enemies. They were organized, structured, powerful enough to move carefully, without exposing themselves too early, which meant they understood the stakes. And more importantly, they understood her value. Elena listened without interruption, not because she accepted what he was saying without question, but because she understood something critical. Information, in this moment, mattered more than reaction. Her mind worked through each detail he allowed her to see. Her family, a connection she had never fully understood, a past that had already begun unraveling, and now, a reason for everything that had happened to her, or at least the beginning of one. But what unsettled her most wasn't the threat. It was the implication. If powerful people were searching for her, then she was not insignificant. She had never been, which meant her entire life. The struggles, the losses, the invisibility had not been random. It had been constructed. That realization landed heavily, because it meant she had not just been surviving. She had been hidden. Dante watched her process it, carefully, precisely, not looking for fear, but for reaction, because reactions revealed truth. And truth, in this situation, was the only thing that mattered. Elena did not break. She did not panic. But something within her shifted. A clarity, a recalibration. Because now, she was no longer trying to understand her situation. She was trying to understand her role in it. That difference changed everything. Dante made his position clear without needing to state it directly. She would remain under his protection, not as a request, not as an option, as a decision. And in his world, decisions were final. The estate, once simply controlled, now felt fortified. Layers of security tightened. Movements became even more precise. Invisible barriers reinforced. Everything adjusted around a single objective: containment, protection, control. But protection, Elena realized, came with a cost. Because safety within those walls did not mean freedom. It meant confinement, a different kind, more refined, more strategic, but confinement nonetheless. She was not allowed to leave, not because she had attempted to, but because she was not meant to. And that distinction mattered, because it confirmed something she had already begun to suspect. Dante was not just reacting. He was anticipating every movement, every possibility, every outcome. He was not protecting her because he felt responsible. He was protecting her because she was part of something larger, something he intended to control. That realization created tension, not loud, not explosive, but constant, because now the balance between them had shifted again. He was no longer just her captor, but he was not her ally either. He was something in between, something far more complicated. Elena began observing him more closely, not out of curiosity, but necessity, because understanding him meant understanding the system she was now trapped inside. She noticed the details others would miss, the way he processed information before acting, the way he never reacted impulsively, the way every decision seemed to account for variables no one else could see. He was not just powerful, he was precise, and precision made him dangerous in ways that raw power never could. But there was something else, something more subtle, something she couldn't fully define yet. Dante Voss was not simply protecting her from external threats. He was also controlling the way those threats reached her, limiting her exposure, managing the information she received, shaping her understanding of the situation, which meant he was not just guarding her, he was positioning her. And that raised a question she could not ignore. For what? The emotional weight of the situation settled in slowly, not overwhelming, not immediate, but persistent, because Elena found herself caught in a reality she could not easily define. Outside those walls, she was being hunted. Inside them, she was being contained. And somewhere between those two extremes was Dante Voss, the man who had bought her, the man who now stood between her and something far more dangerous than she fully understood, which made him both a threat and a shield. That contradiction was what made everything unstable, because trust could not exist in that space, but neither could rejection. She needed him, whether she wanted to or not, and he needed something from her, even if he had not yet revealed what that was. Time passed, but tension did not fade. It sharpened, because the closer the unseen threat moved, the more precise Dante's control became, until eventually, control was no longer enough. The moment came without warning, a shift in the system, not internal, external. Security tightened beyond its already rigid state. Communications changed. Movement patterns altered. This was not precaution anymore. This was response. Dante received the confirmation in silence, but the weight of it was immediate. They had found her, not by accident, not by chance, but through deliberate tracking, which meant one thing: the people searching for Elena Carter were no longer searching. They were closing in, and in Dante's world, when enemies moved this precisely, it meant they were ready to act. Elena felt it before she was told, because the environment changed again, sharper, tighter, more controlled, as if the walls themselves were preparing for impact. She didn't need confirmation. She already knew. Whatever had been coming had arrived, and now there was no distance left between her and the truth. As Dante reviews the incoming threat reports, one fact becomes undeniable. His enemies have located her exact position, and they are already moving to take her. Danger did not always announce itself. Sometimes it revealed itself slowly, layer by layer, until the truth became impossible to ignore. And as Elena Carter remained inside Dante Voss's world, she began to understand something that no outsider ever truly grasped. Power was not just about control. It was about structure, and structure, when built correctly, became untouchable. The shift from being protected to being exposed happened gradually. Dante had not removed the security surrounding her. If anything, it had intensified. But what changed was her access. Not complete freedom, never that, but controlled exposure. Carefully measured glimpses into the system that operated around her. At first, it seemed insignificant. A corridor she had not seen before. A room left accessible longer than necessary. Movements that allowed her to witness interactions she had previously been separated from. But Elena understood patterns, and patterns never change without purpose. This was intentional. Dante Voss was allowing her to see, not everything, but enough to observe, enough to learn, enough to understand. That realization alone was dangerous, because it meant she was no longer just being protected. She was being positioned. The first time she witnessed one of his internal meetings, it was not direct. She was not invited, not acknowledged, but placed in proximity, close enough to hear, to observe, to analyze. The room itself reflected the same precision as the rest of the estate. Minimal, controlled. Every individual present carried presence. Not loud, not aggressive, but sharp, focused. These were not ordinary men. They were decision-makers. People who operated at levels where mistakes were not tolerated, where outcomes mattered more than methods. And at the center of it all, Dante. He did not dominate the room through volume. He didn't need to. Control radiated from him in quieter ways, in the way others waited before speaking, in the way silence formed around his attention, in the way decisions were accepted the moment he made them. He listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, everything aligned. No hesitation, no debate, just execution. Elena studied it all, not emotionally, not with fear, but with clarity, because she realized something critical. This was not chaos. This was organization, highly structured, deeply embedded, far-reaching beyond what she had imagined. What she had once thought of as crime was something entirely different at this level. This was infrastructure, networks that extended across borders, operations that moved quietly through legitimate systems, all controlled by a structure that very few could even see. And Dante Voss stood at the center of it, not as a participant, but as an architect. That realization changed the way she viewed him. He was not simply dangerous. He was calculated. Everything he did had layers, visible actions, hidden intentions, long-term outcomes. And those layers made him far more unpredictable than brute force ever could. As days passed, Elena's role remained undefined, but her awareness sharpened. She began to notice the details others ignored, the subtle hierarchy between individuals, the way information flowed, and more importantly, where it stopped. The unspoken rules that govern movement, speech, and decision-making. She wasn't being taught, but she was learning. And learning, in a world like this, was power. Dante noticed. Of course he did. Nothing within his environment went unnoticed, especially not change. And Elena had changed, not outwardly in ways most would recognize. She still moved with the same controlled composure, still spoke little, still revealed nothing unnecessarily, but internally, she had adapted. Her awareness had sharpened. Her reactions had become more precise, less reactive, more calculated. She was no longer simply observing to survive. She was observing to understand. And understanding, in this environment, meant she was becoming something more than what she had been brought here as. That development did not go unrecognized, but it also was not stopped, which meant it was allowed. That alone raised questions, because Dante Voss did not allow variables to evolve unless they served a purpose. And Elena had begun to wonder, what role was she being shaped for? Her exposure extended beyond internal meetings. Fragments of the larger network began revealing themselves. Encrypted communications, movements of resources across borders, names that carried weight in industries far removed from anything visibly illegal, all connected, all structured, all controlled. It became clear that Dante's empire was not confined to one space. It was layered across multiple realities, visible and invisible, legitimate and hidden, and that made it nearly impossible to dismantle, because to destroy something like this, you first had to understand it, and understanding required access. Access very few ever received, yet she had it, not fully, but enough to recognize its scale. And scale brought consequence, because the larger the system, the more dangerous any disruption became. The emotional realization came quietly, not as fear, but as clarity. Elena understood now. Power was not freedom. Power was responsibility, burden, risk, because the higher someone stood within a structure like this, the more they became a target. And suddenly, her situation made more sense. She was not just being protected because she was vulnerable. She was being protected because she was connected to something that could disrupt this entire system. That thought settled deeply, because it meant her existence was not passive. It was active, even if she did not yet fully understand how. Dante's leadership remained consistent, cold, precise, uncompromising, but not reckless. Every decision accounted for outcome, every risk measured, every move calculated. He did not act to dominate. He acted to maintain control. And control at this level required constant adjustment, because threats did not disappear. They evolved, just like people, just like Elena. The more she observed him, the more she understood. He was not simply reacting to the threat surrounding her. He was preparing for it, positioning resources, aligning allies, anticipating movement, which meant the situation outside was escalating. Even if she could not yet see it directly, one evening, while moving through a restricted part of the state, an area she had only briefly seen before, Elena noticed something different, not obvious, not immediately alarming, but out of place. A door, secured, not heavily guarded in the traditional sense, but isolated, which, in a place like this, meant more than visible security ever could, because isolation indicated importance, and importance indicated information. She didn't approach recklessly. That would have been a mistake. Instead, she observed timing, movement patterns, access points, the system, always the system, because every system had a flaw, not a weakness, but a point of entry. And over time, she found it, not through force, but through patience. A moment where control shifted just enough. A small window, a calculated risk. And Elena stepped inside. What she found was not what she expected. It was not weapons, not money, not anything immediately recognizable. It was information, files, records, data that had not been integrated into the main system. Hidden, separated, protected not by force, but by obscurity, which meant it was important enough to be concealed differently. Elena moved carefully, scanning what she could without disrupting anything. Names, dates, connections, and then she saw something that made everything else stop. Her name, not as Elena Carter, but something else, something older, something buried, something that connected her not just to this world, but to Dante's past. And in that moment, everything shifted, because this was not just about her being hunted. This was not just about her being protected. This was something deeper, something that had been hidden from her, from everyone, except him. And that meant one thing. Dante Voss had known more than he had ever revealed. Much more. Cliffhanger. As Elena stares at the hidden file bearing her true identity, one realization becomes unavoidable. She has just uncovered something Dante never intended anyone to find, and now she cannot unknow it. Truth, once uncovered, never stayed still. It didn't wait for permission. It didn't adjust to comfort. And it never allowed things to go back to the way they were. It changed everything. Elena Carter understood that the moment she stepped out of that hidden room, because what she had seen was not just information. It was intention. It was proof that her life, her identity, had been shaped long before she ever realized it. And more importantly, Dante Voss had known. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate, not loud, not chaotic, but precise. Like the entire system around her had recalibrated itself the moment she crossed a line she was never meant to cross. She didn't rush, didn't panic, because panic would have been a mistake. And mistakes in Dante's world had consequences. Instead, she moved the same way she always had, controlled, measured, unreadable, but internally, everything had changed, because now she wasn't searching for answers. She had them, and those answers were dangerous. It didn't take long. Dante knew. Of course he did. There was no scenario where something like that could happen inside his world without him being aware of it, which meant he had allowed it, or he had been waiting for it. The confrontation came without warning, not dramatic, not aggressive, just inevitable. He found her where she stood, not hiding, not running, waiting, because there was no point in pretending anymore. The silence between them carried weight, not tension alone, but recognition, because both of them understood something fundamental in that moment. The balance had shifted. Dante studied her carefully, not as a captor observing control, but as someone measuring outcome, assessing, recalculating, because Elena Carter was no longer just a variable in his system. She had become something else, something unpredictable, and unpredictability required a response. You accessed something you weren't meant to. The truth behind that statement was an accusation. It was confirmation. Elena didn't deny it, didn't explain it, because explanations would have been irrelevant. What mattered now was not what she had done, but what it meant, and Dante knew that. His gaze didn't harden, didn't soften. It remained exactly what it had always been, controlled, but there was something else beneath it now, something sharper, something more focused, because now the situation was no longer theoretical. It was real. You understand what you stepped into. Again, not a question, a conclusion, and for the first time, Elena allowed herself to meet that understanding fully, not as someone reacting, but as someone choosing, because that was what this moment was, a decision point, the kind that did not allow hesitation, the kind that defined everything that came after. This was the hook that reshaped her reality. Some choices don't determine what happens next. They determine who survives what comes next. And she understood that now. Dante moved slightly, not closer, not further, just enough to shift the dynamic, because this was no longer about control. This was about alignment, There's something coming, his silence implied. Something that involves you. Elena already knew that. But knowing something existed was not the same as understanding its full weight. Dante continued, not with explanations, but with structure. There was a network, not new, not small, and not disconnected from his past. The same network that had resurfaced, the same one that had begun searching for her. But now, they weren't just searching, they were preparing. And that changed everything, because preparation meant intention, and intention meant action, which meant conflict was no longer avoidable. Elena listened without interruption, but her thoughts were moving quickly now, because she understood what he was doing. He wasn't just informing her. He was setting a stage, building a decision, and then he placed it in front of her, not as a command, but as an option, a mission, dangerous, precise, and necessary, something only she could do, not because she was the strongest or the most powerful, but because she was connected in ways no one else was. The objective wasn't explained fully, but it didn't need to be. The implications were clear. This mission would place her directly in the path of the people searching for her. It would expose her, test her, and potentially destroy her. But it would also give her something else. Access, truth, freedom, or at least the possibility of it. And that was where the real conflict began. Because this was no longer about survival alone. This was about choice, loyalty or escape, trust or independence, alignment or resistance. Elena felt it clearly now, the weight of what was being asked of her, because this decision would not just affect her. It would affect everything connected to Dante's world, his empire, his control, his future. And that realization changed the way she looked at him, because for the first time, she understood something critical. Dante Voss was not offering this because he had no other options. He was offering it because he was testing her, testing what she would choose when given power, because power revealed truth, and truth, in his world, determined everything. She didn't answer immediately, because immediate answers were rarely the right ones. Instead, she thought, not emotionally, not impulsively, but strategically. What did she want? Freedom? Yes, but freedom outside his world now meant something different. It meant exposure. It meant risk. It meant becoming a target without protection. And staying meant control, confinement, but also position, influence, understanding, power. That contradiction settled heavily because there was no clear right choice, only consequence. Dante watched her the entire time, not interrupting, not influencing, just observing, because her decision would tell him everything he needed to know about her potential, about whether she was a risk or an asset. And for the first time, Elena realized something that changed everything. He wasn't just testing her loyalty. He was deciding her future, not in terms of control, but in terms of value, which meant this decision would define what she became in his world. Not what she had been, not what she appeared to be, but what she truly was. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was full of calculation, full of consequence. And then Elena made her decision, not spoken, but understood, because in a world like this, words were unnecessary. Actions defined truth, and her choice aligned with something deeper than survival, something sharper than fear, something far more dangerous. Clarity. Dante saw it immediately, because that was what he had been waiting for. Not compliance, not obedience, but alignment. And the moment it happened, something within the dynamic between them shifted again, not drastically, not visibly, but fundamentally, because now they were no longer on opposite sides of the situation. They were part of the same outcome. That didn't make them allies, but it made them connected in a way that couldn't be undone. And that connection was what made everything more dangerous. Dante stepped back slightly, not as retreat, but as acknowledgement, because the test had been completed, and the result had confirmed something he had suspected from the beginning, but had never fully revealed. Until now, because now there was no reason to hide it anymore. You were never random. The truth landed without softness, without hesitation, and Elena felt it immediately because she already knew, but hearing it made it real. Dante's gaze didn't shift, didn't soften, but the meaning behind his next words carried something different, something deeper, something personal, because this was the truth he had never intended to reveal unless necessary. The night I bought you, it wasn't about power. It wasn't about control. It wasn't about dominance. It was about recognition. And that recognition went far beyond anything she had expected, because Elena Carter was not just connected to his past. She was part of it, in a way that changed everything, in a way that meant he hadn't chosen her randomly. He had been waiting for her. Cliffhanger. As the truth settled between them, Elena realizes something far more dangerous than anything before. Dante didn't buy her by chance. He bought her because he already knew exactly who she was. By the time the truth between Elena Carter and Dante Voss had fully surfaced, the conflict surrounding them no longer felt distant. It had shape now. It had direction. And most dangerously of all, it had purpose. What had once seemed like fragments of a hidden past, buried connections, and controlled silences had become something far more dangerous. A war already in motion. Not one driven by impulse or noise, but by memory, betrayal, and unfinished power. The kind of war that did not begin on battlefields. It began in decisions made years earlier, in loyalties broken quietly, in names removed from records, but never from consequence. And Elena, whether she had wanted it or not, was now standing at the center of it. The realization did not come as shock anymore. Shock belonged to earlier versions of her. The woman who had awakened in an unfamiliar room, the woman who had been observed, moved, and measured by forces she did not yet understand. That version of Elena had survived by watching, by staying quiet, by refusing to let fear define her before she could define the danger. But that woman no longer existed in the same form. What remained was sharper, more deliberate, because now Elena understood something she had not been able to see at the beginning. Her life had never drifted into this world by accident. It had been shaped by it long before she knew its name. The losses she had treated as random, the emptiness in her history, the constant sense that something vital had been removed from her before she ever had the chance to claim it. All of it had been part of a design too large for her to recognize when she was younger. The night she was sold had not changed her life. It had revealed it. That truth settled inside her with brutal clarity. Some people are destroyed when they learn they were never living an ordinary life. Elena was not. She became dangerous the moment she understood that her ordinary life had been the lie. It was that realization, cold, sharp, and irreversible, that transformed everything that followed. Dante had known more than he had ever admitted. That much was undeniable now. But what mattered more was why. Why he had chosen her at the auction. Why he had brought her into his world instead of allowing her to disappear into someone else's control. Why he had watched her with the focus of a man measuring more than surface behavior. Why, even before the truth was spoken aloud, he had treated her as if she mattered in ways he refused to explain. The answer was no longer hidden in implication. It lived in the past he had buried. Years before his empire reached its current level of precision, Dante Voss had nearly lost everything to betrayal from within his own structure. It had not come from an enemy standing outside his gates. It had come from someone closer, someone who had understood how his world worked, someone who had gained proximity, trust, and access before tearing open the foundation of what he had built. That betrayal had not died when the traitor fell. It had scattered into shadows, into surviving networks, into hidden bloodlines and erased identities. And Elena was one of those erased truths. Not by guilt, not by choice, by inheritance. She was connected to the fracture that had nearly destroyed him, not as a weapon intentionally sharpened against him, but as living proof that the past he thought he had sealed away was still active beneath the surface. Her existence linked together pieces that should never have survived in the same place. The betrayal, the network that had resurfaced, the hidden identity kept from her, the people now moving carefully to reclaim her before Dante could fully understand what she represented. That was the real reason he had bought her, not for punishment, not for ownership, not even for power in the simplistic sense others would have assumed. He had bought her because he had recognized the pattern before anyone else did, and once he recognized it, he refused to let anyone else control the outcome. That did not make his decision merciful. Elena knew better than to romanticize the logic of a man like Dante Voss. He had not rescued her. He had moved first. There was a difference, and she understood it fully. But within that difference lived another truth, one that complicated everything between them. He had chosen not to eliminate the unknown. He had chosen to keep it close enough to study, protect, and, if necessary, use. At first, Elena had been the subject of that decision. Now she was becoming its force. The change was not announced. No one inside Dante's empire would have been foolish enough to name it openly even if they noticed it. But power shifts rarely begin with words. They begin when a person stops merely surviving a system and starts altering how that system responds to them. Elena had begun doing exactly that. She understood the architecture of Dante's world now, not completely, but enough to read the spaces between commands. Enough to recognize which men followed orders out of loyalty and which followed out of fear. Enough to see where information traveled cleanly and where it hesitated. Enough to understand that a war like this would not be won by strength alone. It would be won by timing, by perception, by knowing which truths to expose and which to keep buried until their value was greatest. She became useful first in silence. Useful because she saw what others ignored. Useful because she understood both vulnerability and concealment in ways powerful men rarely did. Useful because the network moving against Dante did not just want territory, leverage, or revenge. They wanted narrative. They wanted to reclaim what had been hidden and turn it into a weapon. But Elena was no longer willing to be anyone's weapon. That was her transformation. She had begun this story as someone stripped of control. Then she became someone who watched. Now she became someone who influenced. Dante saw it before anyone else. He saw in the way she no longer asked questions to survive a moment, but to identify the shape of what came next. He saw in the way she absorbed information without losing herself to it. He saw it in the discipline with which she held her center, even after learning that so much of her identity had been engineered in absence. Most of all, he saw it in the choices she began making, small at first, then sharper, more consequential. Choices that no longer belonged to frightened logic of a captive, but to the measured judgment of someone stepping willingly into the architecture of conflict. And because Dante Voss was a man who understood value before most people understood presence, he adjusted. He stopped trying to keep Elena outside the edges of the war. He began positioning her within it, not carelessly, not fully, but enough to confirm what neither of them could deny anymore. She was central now, not as a symbol, not as bait, not as collateral, as a deciding force. That truth changed the war itself. The opposing network had once believed Elena could be recovered, manipulated, or contained to the old assumptions surrounding her. They believed the hidden child of a buried fracture would either remain weak, remain confused, or break under the pressure of competing powers claiming to understand her better than she understood herself. They were wrong, because Elena was no longer moving from ignorance. And once a person like her understands she has been shaped by the ambitions of others, she becomes extremely difficult to shape again. The escalation came quickly after that, not in one explosion, but in a series of decisions that made retreat impossible. Safe houses were compromised. Communications lines were quietly severed. Internal loyalties were tested. Old names resurfaced through coded transactions and intercepted messages. Men who had once stayed neutral were forced to choose. Others disappeared before they could. Every move Dante made was answered from the other side with one equally precise. It became clear that the conflict had entered its final stage. Not because one side was stronger, but because both now understood too much to coexist in silence. Elena did not remain protected at the center of it. She acted. The first time she altered the direction of the war, it was through information, a detail she recognized in a recovered file, a discrepancy in a timeline others read as administrative error, a name disguised in one ledger but not another. It was enough to expose a false ally before he could deliver critical access to Dante's enemies. That one intervention prevented a breach that would have cost Dante far more than territory. He did not praise her for it. He did not need to. Men like Dante acknowledged significance differently, through trust measured in access, through silence that no longer excluded, through decisions that revealed he had begun to calculate outcomes with her mind in them, that, more than anything, marked the final evolution of Elena's position. She was no longer merely inside his world. She was shaping it. There was danger in that power. She knew it. Every step deeper into Dante's war made one thing increasingly clear. Influence did not free a person from cost. It made cost inevitable. The more central she became, the less possible it was to return to the life she had once thought she wanted. There would be no simple escape from knowledge like this. No returned anonymity. No future untouched by what she now understood about herself, about Dante, about the violence embedded beneath carefully managed empires. And yet she did not turn away, because another truth had settled into her with equal force. The moment she was sold, everything changed, not because she was taken from her life, but because she was delivered to the truth of it. That truth reached its highest cost when final choices had to be made. The war had narrowed by then. The opposition, cornered but not weak, prepared one last decisive move. They no longer sought only Elena. They sought rupture, exposure, internal collapse. They wanted Dante forced into the kind of uncontrolled retaliation that would fracture his own structure from within. To win, they did not need to kill him immediately. They needed to make him choose wrongly. And for the first time in years, Dante Voss faced a decision he could not resolve through force alone. Elena recognized it before he spoke. He would end the war if necessary, burn through every remaining layer of his enemy's network, remove all uncertainty. But doing so would also destroy the last surviving path to the full truth of her identity and the life stolen from her before she understood what had been taken. The final strike would secure his empire. It might also erase her answers forever. That was the choice. Empire or truth, control or revelation, his world or hers. What made the moment unbearable was not that either option was simple. It was that both of them understood the cost of both. Dante, for all his discipline, had reached the limit of what strategy alone could solve. Elena, for all her growth, had reached a point where she could not remain only an observer of other people's decisions. So she chose, not recklessly, not emotionally, but with the terrifying clarity of someone who now understood exactly what power demanded. She chose the truth, and in choosing it, she stepped into the final movement of the war not as someone Dante protected, but as someone who forced and confronted the one thing he had spent years refusing to measure honestly. The price of control when it collides with the life of someone who now matters beyond strategy. The final conflict did not unfold in spectacle. It unfolded in tension, in exact movements, in one decisive series of actions that exposed the surviving architect of the old betrayal and tore open the hidden structure that had preserved Elena's identity in fragments. Names were confirmed. Histories aligned. The lie surrounding her life collapsed completely. And with it, so did the last illusion Dante had maintained around his own decisions. He had told himself in the beginning that Elena mattered because of what she represented. By the end, that explanation no longer held. She mattered because she had changed the terms of his world. She had shown him that control could secure territory, command loyalty, and end threats, but it could not protect a man from the cost of feeling the consequences of his own choices. It could not prevent transformation. It could not keep him untouched by the one force he had first tried to define only as risk. Elena, when the war finally reached its temporary end, nothing felt victorious. Too much had been revealed for that. Too much had been paid. Months later, distance existed where intensity once ruled every hour. Not absolute distance, not peace, but space, earned uneasy necessary. Elena no longer moved through Dante's world as someone enclosed by it. She had taken what she needed from the truth, and the truth had taken its share from her in return. She was no longer a victim of decisions made around her. She was no longer only the woman who had watched, adapted, and endured. She was the woman who had changed the war, and that could never be undone. When she walked away from the center of Dante's empire months later, she did not do it as someone escaping him. She did it as someone finally understanding what had bound him from the beginning. Not ownership, not rescue, not fate in any sentimental sense. Collision, A collision between power and truth, between a man who believed control could contain everything and a woman whose existence proved otherwise. Elena understood one truth then with complete certainty. He never intended to lose control, but she was the only one who made him realize what control truly costs. And far beyond the distance she had created, Dante Voss stood in the silence of everything still unresolved, already understanding that if she ever stepped back into his world again, the war they survived would not be the most dangerous thing waiting for them.